Okay, well, as you all know, we are looking into we just finished looking at the transition between the Old Testament and the New Testament times. And I've been going through the different, let's see how I put it, the different characters, political characters and religious characters that were involved in ruling over the people of Israel when Jesus came into the world and during the first century. And last week we looked at the Roman Caesars. I guess that was what it was, not last week, but 2 weeks ago. And today we're going to look at the procurators and the high priests. At least that's my intention. Now, the Romans kept changing the way they called things. So sometimes they're called governors, sometimes they're called procurators. So just depending on what you're reading, the same office might be called by those two different names. And the procurators in every part of the Roman world were underneath. They didn't answer directly to Rome or to the Caesar. They answered to a legate, and the legate that the procurators of Israel answered to resided up in Syria and maybe Damascus or Antioch or somewhere in Syria at least. And so those figure into things. Quirinius was one of them. He's the one that, on his orders from Caesar, he ordered the census that took place when in the time that Jesus was born, which is why he was born in Bethlehem. But they had procurators at that time as well, that Quirinius would have ordered. Let's just look at this list. In a few years before Christian era, Coponius was a procurator over Israel, and then no, pardon me. I didn't put on the list the ones before. This is Coponius was from 6 to 9, what I call AD, what you would call AD. They call it nowadays, they call it Christian era, to keep from having to call it after or Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. They don't want to, the modern people don't want to have the Lord mixed into the years that we call things, so they call it Christian era now. But it was really like 6 to 9 AD was Coponius. So I don't know who the procurator was before that. But anyway, you're not going to recognize most of these names: Coponius, Marcus Ambibulus, Rufus Tinius, all these. But then here's one here that sounds a little bit familiar, and that is Pontius Pilate. I'm not going to talk about all these ones that don't have anything to do with any of the history that we know or of the New Testament. I'm just going to talk about the ones that come up in our Bible study, and the first one being Pontius Pilate. Now, Pontius Pilate was a typical Roman, not of the antique simple stamp. These are not my words. I took this out of a dictionary. But of an imperial period, a man not without some remains of the ancient Roman justice in his soul, yet pleasure-loving, imperious, and corrupt. He hated the Jews whom he ruled, and in times of irritation freely shed their blood. They returned his hatred with cordiality and accused him of every crime, maladministration, cruelty, and robbery. He visited Jerusalem as seldom as possible. These procurators lived in Caesarea, over on the coast of Israel. Caesarea Herod had built and made it a really nice Roman city. So the procurators lived there. He came to Jerusalem as less often as possible, for indeed to one accustomed to the pleasures of Rome with the theaters, baths, games, gay society, Jerusalem with its religiousness and ever smoldering revolt was a dreary residence. When he did visit, he stayed in the palace of Herod the Great, it being common for the officers sent by Rome into the conquered countries to occupy the palaces of the displaced sovereigns. Well, Herod's palace was north, maybe a little bit east of Jerusalem, but northeast about 9-10 miles. Wasn't far from Jerusalem. It was right near Bethel, and it exists today. I mean, the ruins of it, I should say. There's a big mound. Looks like a volcano, kind of like mound with a really nice castle built on top of it, and a palace at the bottom of it. And so that was just one of the fortresses that Herod the Great had built, but he built it for himself. So obviously it's going to have all the good stuff. And so anyway, now at this time, Pontius Pilate was occupying that. And we all know that Pontius Pilate was the one who found Jesus to be innocent, but upon the insistence of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and all the people shouting, crucify him, he says, all right, I'm washing my hands of this, you have at it. And that's not saying he was a weak man. Some people say, well, he was just weak and couldn't stand up to the people. Well, he wasn't weak, but he also was a politician. And he, when he wanted to, he could be as mean as they come, kill people, that sort of thing. And he did. But in this case, being at the time of the greatest feast of the Jewish folks, and all the people smoldering in rebellion anyway already, there was a group of folks that you've all heard of called the Zealots, who were always for revolt, and things were really not very settled at all at this time. And as a good politician, in order to keep things quiet, he figured probably in his mind, what's one person? Let's just keep the peace. Even the Jews said it's expedient that one man die, that kind of thing. And so Pontius Pilate just did what a lot of politicians would do just to keep peace. Just keep in mind that he had to answer to a legate, who in turn answered to Caesar. And the one thing the Romans did not put up with was a ruckus. You can do whatever you want in your country as long as you don't cause a big problem. If you cause a big problem, we'll come and fix it. And so Pilate was also saving his own self by being politically going along with these people just to keep the peace. So anyway, that was Pontius Pilate. And then you go down through a whole bunch of other ones that Marcellus, Marullus, Fatus. Anyway, finally you come down to another one that you recognize, and that is Antonius Felix. Probably don't know the name Antonius in front of Felix, but certainly if you've studied the book of Acts, you've heard of Felix. That was the one that Paul went before. I'll read about that here, reading from another dictionary. It says, Suetonius speaks of the military honors that the emperor conferred on him and specifies his appointment as governor of the province of Judea. So he's called governor there, and he's a procurator, same thing. Adding an innuendo that loses nothing by its brevity, namely that he was the husband of 3 queens or 3 royal ladies. Tacitus, Suetonius was a historian, and so was Tacitus around this same time. Tacitus in his history declares that during his governorship in Judea, he indulged in all kinds of cruelty and lust, exercising regal power and with the disposition of a slave. And in his annals, he represents Felix as considering himself licensed to commit any crime, relying on the influence that he possessed at court. Having a grudge against Jonathan, the high priest, who had expostulated with him on his misrule, he made use of Doris, an intimate friend of Jonathan, in order to get him assassinated by the gang of villains who joined the crowds that were going up to the temple to worship. This crime led subsequently to countless evils by the encouragement that it gave to the Sicarii, or leagued assassins of the day, to whose excesses Josephus ascribes under Providence, the overthrow of the Jewish state. That's just a scholarly way of saying that these Sicarii, these were called the assassins, and what they did was they had mastered the art of disguise and making themselves invisible in a crowd. And by invisible, I don't mean you can't really see them, but you would just never notice them. They blend in, and they can be in and out, and they all carried a super sharp dagger, and they would go in and assassinate people, priests, many of the Sanhedrin and Roman officials, whoever, these guys, they were part of the zealots, and they were called Sicarii. They were the assassins. They were the ones that would sneak in and blend into the crowd, and next thing you know, somebody has fallen on the ground bleeding to death because they got stabbed. And these guys were a constant, it almost sounds like a pun, a thorn in the sides of both the Jewish leaders and the Romans, and they literally carried thorns in their clothing that they could stab people with. And if you read Josephus, he tells lots of stories about what went on with these assassins, and they were largely responsible for the final Caesar saying, all right, let's wipe these people out because we just can't control them. Anyway, while in office, he became enamored of Drusilla, a daughter of King Herod Agrippa, who was already married to Azizus, king of Emesa. And through the influence of Simon, a magician, prevailed on her to a union with him. So Simon the sorcerer, we read about in the book of Acts, somehow he was involved. He had influence over Drusilla, and he convinced Drusilla to go with Felix and divorce this king of Emesa. Anyway, with this adulterous Felix was seated when Paul reasoned before him in Acts 24. Another Drusilla is mentioned by Tacitus as being the first wife of Felix. So just like Herod had 2 wives named Mariamne, Felix also had 2 wives of the same name, both named Drusilla. And this Drusilla, the second Drusilla, she ended up, along with Felix, being deported, I guess you would say, and she ended up in exile. She got placed in Pompeii, She was there in 79 AD when, guess what happened? Mount Vesuvius erupted, and that's where she came to her end, was under the hot mud. No, he was. It was just Drusilla. I think Felix died. Excuse me. But anyway, that's how Drusilla came to her end. But anyway, she was Felix's wife, and the next paragraph says, Paul, having been arrested at Jerusalem, was sent by Claudius Lysias to Felix at Caesarea. Felix, being the procurator, was residing at Caesarea, and when Paul got in trouble in Jerusalem, Paul was sent to Caesarea, and he was confined in Herod's judgment hall until his accusers came. The Jews followed him the next day, and they.
Because you found out he was Caesarea. So Paul said, Pilate said, "Oh, you need to."
No, this is a different time. This was the time when the young man went and told Agrippa about the Jew says we won't eat until we've killed Paul. And so when that plot was revealed, Agrippa sent him over to Felix with that, accompanied by 200 soldiers, and they all just went straight through overnight, a forced march over to Caesarea. That was when all that happened. But then the Jews accusers arrived the next day, and after 5 days, headed by I guess they started my memory says it was the next day that they followed after him, but maybe it was anyway. This says after 5 days, headed by Ananias the high priest, and their case was managed by Tertullus, who to conciliate. Oh, I gotta get you where you can read it. To conciliate Felix, expressed gratitude on the part of the Jews, since we have through you attained much peace, and since your providence reform are being carried out for this nation, we acknowledge this in every way and everywhere, most excellent Felix. So the Jews were buttering up Felix, trying to get him to release Paul back to them so that they could kill him. Then Tertullus proceeded to accuse Paul, charging him first with sedition, and second with being a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, and third with an attempt to profane the temple at Jerusalem. These are all things that you read about in the book of Acts. And the evident purpose was to persuade Felix to give up the apostle to the Jewish courts, in which case his assassination would have been easily accomplished. Felix now gave the prisoner permission to speak, and the apostle, after briefly expressing his satisfaction that he had to plead his cause before one so well acquainted with the Jewish customs, he was also able to butter up the Roman Felix. He refuted Tertullus step by step, and Felix deferred inquiry into this case for the present. Well, then when Lysias, the commander, comes down, he said, "I will decide your case." Meanwhile, he placed Paul under the charge of the centurion who had brought him to Caesarea. Some days after, Felix came into the audience chamber with his wife Drusilla, and the prisoner was brought before them. As a faithful preacher, Paul spoke to the Roman libertine and the profligate Jewish princess, that is, Felix and Drusilla, as he spoke of righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. Felix became frightened. Paul was telling him, "You guys are not living like you should be either." And he was frightened, but still nothing was decided. And Felix said, "Go away for the present, and when I find time, I will summon you." We're told why the governor shut his ears to conviction, even neglected his official duty, and kept his prisoner in cruel suspense. Here's why. He was hoping that money would be given to him by Paul. And hence, he frequently sent for Paul and had many conversations with him, but his hopes were unfulfilled, and he kept the apostle prisoner for 2 years. Well, then, meanwhile, the political state of Judea grew more embarrassing. It was during the 2 years of Paul's imprisonment that disturbances took place in the streets of Caesarea. In the end, Felix was summoned to Rome. That's not something that you want to have happen to you if you're one of the leaders. He was summoned to Rome, and it was at this time he went on trial and ended up getting banished, and that's how Drusilla ended up in Pompeii. Well, let's see. Thus it was that he was anxious to do the Jews a favor, and he left Paul imprisoned. At Rome, he was saved from suffering the penalty due his atrocities by the influence of his brother Pallas. So Felix went on trial in Rome and should have been punished worse than he was, but his brother Pallas, a high Roman official, got him off essentially, and so he didn't have to suffer the penalty. Anyway, that's from Unger's, and that deals with Felix. So you go down a little ways from Felix, not very far from Felix. The next one after him was Porcius Festus. Festus is another one that we read about in the book of Acts. He was appointed by the Emperor Nero, probably in the autumn of AD 60. 3 days after his arrival at Caesarea, he went up to Jerusalem. Here he was met by the chief priests and the leading men of the Jews, who brought charges against Paul. They requested as a favor that he would allow Paul to be brought up to Jerusalem. The plea doubtless was that he should be tried before the Sanhedrin. The real purpose, however, was to kill him while on the way. Well, Festus refused to comply and told him that they must meet the accused face to face at Caesarea. So at least he gave Paul a fair shake of it. And after 8 or 10 days, Paul was summoned before Festus and asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem. Festus, wanting to placate the Jews as much as possible, he said, "If you're willing, I'll send you to Jerusalem." Well, Paul was not willing. The apostle, knowing full well the danger that lurked in his proposal and conscious of the rights that he possessed as a Roman citizen, refused to accede and replied boldly to Festus, concluding with, "I appeal to Caesar." You're not sending me back to Jerusalem. Paul knew what was going to happen to him if he got sent back to Jerusalem. And so he appealed to Caesar, as you read about in Acts as well. About this time, Herod Agrippa, with his sister Bernice, came on a complimentary visit to Festus and was consulted by the governor. The result was an interview between the three and Paul, in which the latter delivered a famous discourse and was pronounced innocent. But because he had appealed to Caesar, Festus sent him to Rome. Festus said, "We see that you're innocent, and if you hadn't appealed to Caesar, this would be over with. But once you say I appeal to Caesar, the die is cast, you got to go to Rome." So he sent him to Rome. A few other facts are mentioned concerning Festus. Judea was in the same disturbed state that it had been under the procuratorship of Felix. He took part with Agrippa against the priests, who built a wall to obstruct Agrippa's view of the temple, but allowed an appeal to Nero. Bottom line is, the Jews hated Agrippa, and so they built a wall high enough to where Agrippa from the Antonius fortress couldn't look down into the temple area. And so Agrippa tried to get Festus to make him tear down the wall, but he sided at first, at least he sided with the Jewish folks. But then, but he said, oh, if you want to appeal to Caesar, that's all right, you can do that. So they appealed to Caesar, who decided in favor of the Jews. Festus probably died in the summer of AD 62. All right, so that's the sum total of the procurators that we know about. After Festus, there's one guy named Albinius, and then there's one called Florus. These two were horrible, and they ended up, because of how terribly they ruled, the Jews really revolted about 66 AD. And when they really revolted, then the Roman says, we're done with you guys. We're sending an army over to destroy Israel. And so it was largely because of Albinius and Justinius Florus that the Jews finally totally erupted into revolt. And that's what brought on the destruction of Israel. Okay, so that's the procurators. These are the Roman rulers of the area of Jerusalem, or well, Jerusalem and Judea, the whole what we call Israel today. So next, I want to look at the high priests of Israel. The first high priest that I want to look at briefly is the Hasmoneans. Hasmoneans, if you remember, were the Maccabees. Judas Maccabeus was the Maccabee means hammer of God. He's the first one to be called that. Anyway, that was a title, a guess, or a nickname given to him. They were in a Hasmonean family. Anyway, I'm not going to go in depth in any of these because most of these, as you can, all of these on this page are before Jesus came into the world, before up until the time of Julius Caesar, the first Caesar. Anyway, these are the guys you might remember some of the names from Brandon talking to us: John Hyrcanus, Aristobulus, Antigonus. These are all ones that he mentioned, and but they were all in the intertestament period. And so these were high priests. None of these guys were of the tribe of Levi. They had gotten so far away from doing things according to the law of Moses that the high priests had nothing to do with the way God expected things to happen. These were from a family of Hasmoneans. Anyway, then during the Herodian and Roman period, which is what we'll be interested in, is a whole list of high priests. When you add it all up, I can't remember if I put it. Let me just, well, I forget how many high priests there were just in the time of from Jesus until the destruction of Jerusalem, but they averaged 3 years. And it was a for life, supposed to be a for life appointment. The high priests, they weren't necessarily dead, they just got shoved around. The Romans kept appointing whoever they wanted to be the high priest, and so they might still be living, but they just weren't officially the high priest according to the Romans. In the case in the time of Jesus' crucifixion, there was Annas and Caiaphas. Annas was the high priest according to the Jews, but Caiaphas had been appointed by the Romans. So the Romans recognized Caiaphas as the leader of the Jews, and the Jews themselves recognized Annas, if they recognized anybody. But a lot of the Jews didn't like any of the high priests and didn't really try to follow them anyway. Things were just so messed up during this whole time. But as far as looking at these, you'll see a lot of names that you don't even recognize. And even the one that I'm going to look at right now, this Simon, son of Boethius, from Alexander, he was made high priest about 25 BC by Herod the Great, in order that his marriage with Boethius's daughter, whose name was Mariamne the second. If you remember, Mariamne the second was the wife that Herod loved and killed. Loved her so much he killed her. Anyway, I brought that in there because this whole, if you look on this list, both this, there's a kind of a dynasty going there. Anyway, this Simon was the first of the Boetheuses, I guess you'd say. Anyway, I just put that in there because we talked about how Herod the Great had married Mariamne and ended up killing her. Anyway, this high priest was the father of Mariamne. The next one that I want to look at is Jazar ben Boethus. Jozar was unpopular and an advocate of compliance with the census of Quirinius. The Jews didn't want to comply, but they ended up having to because they were under the thumb of the Romans. And Quirinius had that in 4 BC. The hatred of the Pharisees towards this high priestly family is shown by the words of the Tana, Abba Saul ben Batnit, who lived about the year 40 AD at Jerusalem. It must be especially noted that the house of Boethus heads the list of the wicked and sinful priestly families enumerated by Abba. So this Abba means father. So father's so-and-so, one of the Jewish, probably a member of the Sanhedrin at the time, wrote some things down about this Jozar. They didn't like any of the Boethus families because they were kind of on the side of the Romans. Most of these high priests were Sadducees. Sadducees, one of the things that distinguished them from the Pharisees was that they were pro-Roman. They were pro-Hellenizing or becoming like the Greeks, the Romans. And of course, the Jews didn't want to try to be like everybody else. The Pharisees didn't want that at all. So anyway, that's this guy. Sue?
I wonder if that's how that got incorporated as through the centuries for the Catholic Church.
It might well have. I don't know the exact history of the Catholic Church where they got their doctrine from. I mean, it's totally opposed to what Jesus said. Don't call any man on earth Abba. Well, they ended up calling him anyway. But it was probably men like this that Jesus was talking about, that they, during his time, that they had men like this guy that they called Abba. And that was a title that only belonged to God, because you have one Father, that's God. Okay, so anyway, the next one I wanted to talk about was this Annas ben Seth. Now, Annas is a name that we're familiar with. Annas and Caiaphas. This Annas ben Seth. He was appointed by the Roman legate Quirinius as the first high priest of the newly formed Roman province of Judea in AD 6. Just after the Romans had deposed Archelaus, the ethnarch of Judea, thereby putting Judea directly under Roman rule. This is politics, stuff that were going on during the infancy, I guess you'd say, or the toddler ages of Jesus. And like I said, things got shifted around a lot by the Romans. The Israelites just called the whole area from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea. That whole area was Israel, where the children of Israel lived. The Romans divided up between Judea sometimes and Samaria and Galilee, and sometimes it was Samaria and Galilee all together as one province, and Judea. Sometimes they're all mixed. Anyway, it could be confusing, but the bottom line is the Romans were ruling, and so were the high priests supposed to be ruling at the same time, and the general population didn't care much for any of them, even the high priests, but they just had to put up with them because that's where they lived. So anyway, Annas, notice it says from 6 to 15 AD. Well, I'll bring it up in a second. The next one we'll look at is Joseph ben Caiaphas. We all know Caiaphas. He's just called Caiaphas, just like Annas is just called Annas in the New Testament. And Caiaphas, even though his name is Joseph, son of Caiaphas, he was just called Caiaphas in the Bible. He was the son-in-law of the high priest Annas ben Seth. So Annas, that we just looked at, he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, and Caiaphas was the son-in-law of Annas. Annas got deposed. Well, the Jews never accepted any of these, and Joseph Caiaphas was, by the time that when Jesus died in AD 30, it was Caiaphas. But really, they still recognized, the Jewish folks just recognized Annas the whole time. So it can make it a bit confusing, but it just adds to our understanding of how chaotic everything was and how messed up stuff were. That when finally it was time. It was time and God used the Romans to accomplish his purpose that he had said was going to happen from the Old Testament prophets that we read, that prophesied that it was going to come to an end down the road. But Daniel was told, seal up the vision, for it's not going to be for a while. Was it Daniel or Ezekiel? One or the other. I can't remember which one it was right now. But now we're at the point 400 years later where now it's been a while, and now this vision is going to come true, and the nation of Israel is going to be destroyed once and for all. So anyway, that's I'm going to read about Joseph ben Caiaphas. He was a Jewish high priest who, according to the Gospels, organized a plot to kill Jesus. He famously presided over the Sanhedrin trial of Jesus. The primary sources for Caiaphas's life are the New Testament and the writings of Josephus. Josephus records that he was made high priest by the Roman procurator Valerius Gratus. So anyway, that puts Josephus or Caiaphas where he belongs. Then the next one, as you continue on from 37 to 41 AD, is Theophilus ben Annas. This is kind of an interesting one. His name is Theophilus. We've heard that name before, haven't we? Well, I just want to read this, what it says. He was the high priest in the second temple in Jerusalem from 37 to 41 AD. According to Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, he was a member of one of the wealthiest and most influential Jewish families in Judea province during the first century. Then it says, a growing but still uncommon belief points to the high priest Theophilus as the person to whom the Gospel of Luke is addressed. And so it may well be in Luke, he addresses him as, I forget which word it is, but it's like the Honorable Theophilus or something along that line, where it intimates that he was a person of high office. And then in Acts, it doesn't call him that. He talks to him as a regular person. Yeah, more like a friend. And it corresponds exactly with what happened with Theophilus. He was a high priest, but then he got deposed from the high priesthood and became a regular guy. And the time frame fits exactly as well. So this Theophilus may very well have been the one that Luke was writing to. And it's just an interesting thing if that was the case. Well, Yeah, I can only guess about that, but it's possible that that's the case. Obviously, Luke cared enough about the guy to write a second book, to finish the history. After talking about Jesus's life, then he talked about the life of the church. So it may well have been. And Theophilus Ben Ananias was also he was deposed in 41, but that doesn't mean he died then. He could have been just a regular guy for a long time after that, when Luke would have written the second book, the book of Acts. So anyway, that's just an interesting bit of it's pretty much speculation on that part, but it makes quite a bit of sense. The next one I want to look at is Ananias, the son of Nedebius. This was a high priest who, according to Acts of the Apostles, presided during the trials of the apostle at Jerusalem. We know him just as Ananias. And he when Paul was on trial in Jerusalem, before he got sent over to Felix in Caesarea, that was this guy, and Ananias, and he, like it says, he was 46 to 58. So in 58, we're getting closer and closer to the end of Paul's life, but Paul still had business to attend to, and he got sent to Rome. He was in Rome in prison, and then he made that other journey that we talked about at the end of the book of Acts after that, but that was after 58 AD. Okay, so the next one I wanted to look at was Jonathan. Let me, well, maybe I better quit because our time's up and there's a few more left. So we'll start with Jonathan next time. Any quick questions or comments? No, that's different. There are a lot of Ananias. There's Ananias and Sapphira. This Ananias, the Ananias that preached to Paul when Paul was in Troas, not Troas. When Paul went up to Damascus. So anyway, it's different. It was a very common name. All right, class dismissed, and we'll get back together at the top of the hour. Okay. This morning follows the same kind of a theme. James chapter 4, verses 13 to 15. James says this: "Come now, you who say, tomorrow we will go and do such and such a city and spend a year there and buy and sell and make profit, whereas you know not what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that." Well, I preached this lesson after we got back a year ago, October, after we got back from our long trip to back east with our trailer. We were with two friends, Ron and Gloria Cope, who live in near Coeur d'Alene. They had a trailer too, and I started the lesson by just saying thank you to all of you for letting us go and enjoy that long trip. And it was indeed a long trip, all the way from Washington, all the way to the farthest north and east that you can drive a car, all the way to West Quaddy Head in the state of Maine. And during the course of that trip, we stopped at Niagara Falls, got to see those beautiful falls and ride in the Maid of the Mist boat and get all wet. And when we finally made it all the way as far east and north as you can go in a car, we were at West Quaddy Lighthouse in Lubec, Maine. It's a beautiful place. Very thankful to be able to go there. We also down below that lighthouse is the beach. That's if you go and put your foot in the water, that's as far, or just go just far enough to not put your foot in the water. That's as far east as you can stand on land in the United States of America. And then we went south a little ways to Acadia National Park in Maine. Beautiful place with. And we went further down to Massachusetts to Cape Cod, went all the way to the very end of Cape Cod. From there, we went to New York City. We camped in Long Island, New York, and Sue and Gloria, the two women of our group, didn't want to go to the city of New York. Sue had already been there, and Gloria didn't have an interest in it, so they stayed and wanted to go on Long Island to the Hamptons. And so Ron and I went to New York City, got to visit there. After that, we left and went down, and we got to go to the Ark experience, see that amazing tribute to Noah's Ark, and showing how it could really have happened and housed all the animals. You can see the little people at the bottom. That's the height of a person, so you get an idea. And these are built just to the specifications in the Bible of Noah's Ark. And I'd love to show you all the pictures from inside the Ark. It's absolutely fantastic. But anyway, after that, we went to Nashville and visited some family. Had a little run-in with our transmission there at that time, and ended up having to stay a few extra days. But we also got to visit my cousin in near Louisville, Kentucky, but in Indiana, and this is their farm, or part of their farm. And I just wanted to say thanks to God for keeping us safe for 8,300 miles as we drove all that distance. I don't think we even saw an accident, let alone had any close calls or were in one. But anyway, during the course of this journey, something happened that I want to relate, and it is indeed a shocking story, something that you really don't want to have happen. And it happened in a New York minute. We all know what a New York minute is. It's just like that. And because it happened in a New York minute, it's because it happened in New York City. Ron and I took an hour-long train ride from Long Island, where we were camped from Long Island into the city of New York to Union Station, big famous station right near Times Square in the middle of downtown New York. From there, we got onto a hop-on, hop-off bus and took a tour of the city for 3 hours, riding around. And we finally got tired. The bus was going so slow, we got tired. We decided to get off of the bus and thought we could make our way faster on foot or taking a cab to places that we wanted to go. Anyway, by the time we had taken the hour-long train ride, taken the tour for 3 hours, it was getting close to lunchtime, and we tried to go up into the Empire State Building, but realized we didn't have our COVID cards with us to prove that we had the vaccine. They wouldn't let us up there. So we decided on plan B, and we were hungry, and I wanted some New York pizza, some of that thin New York style pizza. And so we looked around and found Joe's Pizza. 46 years it had been in business, and they'd been serving hundreds of slices of pizza every day. And Joe's Pizza is right on Broadway, just at the north end of Times Square. And so we went in and we stopped inside and found a heavenly smell of wonderful pizza cooking, and saw all these huge slices of pizza that you can just buy by the slice. And by the time we got up there in line, told them what we wanted, and in a New York minute, I had two giant slices of pizza, just like this. Ron only had one. If you knew him, you'd know why. He's just a wimp. But anyway, I shouldn't say that about him unless he was here. But anyway, I had two slices, and as I was carrying my plate away to my table, my face looked like this. I was so excited to eat that pizza. And in fact, I did eat that pizza. Notice the floor beneath where we're standing there is concrete. That'll make a difference in just a moment. Well, we were in Joe's Pizza, and I happened to be sitting right where this woman is in the picture right here. As you can see, it's got a clear line of the door. Those two, I think this whole front facade is just there for during the high tourist time. In the wintertime, it goes away. So it's just built out to give extra places to sit, but these doors just open up and stay like that. You can see they're just wooden doors. Anyway, they make a little hallway as you go in. I was sitting inside of those doors, and we were eating our pizza. And as we were eating, we had almost gotten done. In fact, Ron had finished his piece of pizza, and he went over. He was standing about right behind this door, just right over here a little ways, just behind the door. And he was putting some stuff together in a bag that he had bought while we were touring around. And I was just finishing up the last couple bites of my two pieces of pizza. And all of a sudden I heard a commotion, and I could tell it was outside, and didn't know what was happening, but a distinct different sound, a commotion happened. And all of a sudden I saw a dark shadow flash by in front of me, just out of the periphery of my vision. And it was going like from coming this way, and just went across in front, just like this. I just saw the shadow, and then I heard a thud. And then the next thing I saw was a woman getting smashed up against this wall, this door right here. And she fell unconscious backwards onto the concrete floor, and her head hit really hard. And she was just lying there. She was already unconscious before she even hit the ground because of hitting against the door. And so she didn't try to spare herself or anything. Her head just hit really hard on the concrete floor. And in a New York minute, Maria Ambrosio lay there on the concrete. She was lying there unconscious, and she never did wake up. She went from just being unconscious to being brain dead in the time that we were standing there over trying to help her. I had just witnessed a murder. A man had been up the street about a block. He had smashed another woman in the face and stole her cell phone. And he went running away, getting away from this theft as she was shouting after him, and people were looking around, wondering what to do, trying to chase him or whatever. And as he ran by, that's the shadow that I saw running across in front. And as he ran by, exactly at the time that Maria Ambrosio and her friends were walking out of the restaurant. They had just been eating pizza, just like me. And as they walked out the door, he smashed into them, and Maria went smashing against the door and fell backwards, never to regain consciousness. In a New York minute, this woman had lost her life, not even knowing what was going on. Well, this guy bounced off of her, almost fell down himself, but he got his balance and went running down the street, where in about a block, he made the mistake of bouncing off of a policeman, who then immediately stopped him and arrested him. So he was caught right away. But that didn't help Maria at all. This actually made the news, and actually made national news. The New York newspaper said this about it: a woman knocked down by a Times Square mugger dies surrounded by family and friends. She was kept on life support for a day, and then they realized that they couldn't do anything for her, so they pulled the plug at the next evening. But notice what it says: the New Jersey cancer nurse who was knocked down by a deranged homeless mugger in Times Square died Saturday evening after clinging to life for a day and a half. They just pulled the plug on her. She's gone. Maria Ambrosio's brother, Carlito, texted the Post at 8:28 p.m. Ambrosio, who was 58 years old, was walking through Times Square around 1:30 p.m. Friday with friends after accompanying a pal to the Philippines consulate in Midtown and having lunch before heading home. Friends and family said it was the same time that cops say Jermaine Foster allegedly went on a crime spree, grabbing a cell phone out of a 29-year-old woman's hands west of at West 41st Street and Broadway, and then slamming into Ambrosio as he fled. She was rushed to Bellevue with head trauma. New York Times had this to say: nurse dies after she's knocked to the ground in Times Square. Maria Ambrosio, 58, who worked through the pandemic in a New Jersey hospital, was knocked down by a man who was fleeing after snatching a cell phone, police said. In a New York minute, just like that, this woman's life was gone, and this guy's life was changed forever. James says this in James chapter 5, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Life is short. Here for a while and then just vanishes away. Life is brief at best, but it can be cut short, as in this case, in an instant, without even knowing what's going on. But then there's the perpetrator, the guy that ended up doing this, 26-year-old Jermaine Foster. This is the guy that stole the cell phone, and he headed off with it and ended up killing a woman. I'm sure he did not intend to do that. We'll talk about that in a minute. Here's what the news said about him. Foster, 26, who is homeless, was charged early Saturday morning with robbery and assault in connection with the incidents, police said. This was the Saturday news. Now, after that, he was charged with second-degree murder. So this young man became a murderer on this day in a New York minute. His life was changed forever in a New York minute. The news continued. It said, this is an exclusive: family member of Jermaine Foster, suspect in the death of Nurse Maria Ambrosio, speaks out. It's so heartbreaking. As CBS 2's Kieran Dillon reports, Orette Montague remains in shock. His stepson, 26-year-old Jermaine Foster, is charged with murder in connection with the death of 58-year-old Maria Ambrosio. He's never gotten into trouble like this, he said. I feel so bad for them. I know, it's so heartbreaking. CBS New York said Ambrosio, a longtime oncology nurse at Bayonne Hospital Medical Center, was in Times Square Friday afternoon with friends when police allege Foster plowed into her outside the pizzeria while running away after stealing another woman's phone moments before. Ambrosio was pushed. She fell and cracked her skull and later died. Sources say Foster took off but was arrested minutes later, adding that he was also involved in a home invasion robbery shortly before at a woman's apartment nearby, as well as a groping incident in Midtown last month. Here's what his stepfather said: stealing a phone? That's impossible. He has his phone. He's not that type of guy. Since he was a religious man. Well, what can you say? The family is sure he must have been off his medication to do something like this. Anytime he's not on his medication, he doesn't think right, Montague said. When his dad died from COVID-19, he was left alone. Foster's family says he's not a violent person and has no prior record beyond this incident and what happened last month. They want more resources to help those with mental illness. As for Ambrosio, her family says knowing Foster suffers from mental illness or is homeless is of little consolation. This guy is now a murderer, 26 years old. Now he's a murderer, all just in a New York minute. What this emphasizes is the little choices that we make can have repercussions that we can't even imagine. I can't begin to think that this guy woke up that morning and said, you know, I think I'll go out and kill somebody today. I don't even know that he even thought he'd go out and steal anything. But in one New York minute, he made a choice to steal that woman's cell phone, which meant he had to take off running. And in taking off running, he ended up killing a woman and now being charged with murder. We need to be on the ball every moment of our lives. The same things can happen to us. I'm not saying that all of us will become a murderer, but we make choices, just little choices that don't seem very significant. I mean, stealing a cell phone, yeah, that's not very good, but compared to what he did in a few moments, pretty insignificant. But you just don't know what can trigger what in our lives. One little lie, one little saying something to somebody that doesn't need to get said, or, you know, just so many things. We need to be on the ball every moment and be thinking every moment of our lives, Jesus died because we, as human beings, we sin from time to time, but we want to keep that to the bare minimum and not make any mistakes that will last forever and ever. Well, we just need to be on the ball all the time. Be aware of what's going on around us. Just want to talk for a second. One New York moment later, had this man run by 1 moment later, Ron and I were picking up our stuff. We were getting ready to walk right out the door. In 1 New York minute, that could have been me. It could have been me that he plowed into and plastered up against the wall. And I've heard it say, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. I'm about 1 foot taller than this Maria Ambrosia was. I would have hit that concrete harder than she hit it. And you might not have seen me. It could have gone many different ways. I could have been blindsided by this guy just like Maria was. And if that had happened, I would not be here standing to you, talking to you today. Could have gone another way. Maybe he would have bounced off me because I'm bigger, He would have bounced off me and gone on his way, running away with his cell phone. Jermaine Foster would not be up for murder. And I would just be wondering what just happened. What a difference a New York minute makes. You would be probably frightened to death if you knew all the things that happened just 1 minute before you were there or 1 minute after you were there. So many things happen, but sometimes they happen while you were there, and you've got to always be ready to do the right thing. Life can change just that fast, just as fast as a New York minute. And we need to be prepared for whatever happens every single moment of every single day. There's one more moment that I want to talk about. And that moment is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, starting with verse 51. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in a New York moment, in the twinkling of an eye at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. So when the corruptible has put on incorruption, and the mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory? The sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is in the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Another passage that I want to look at is in Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Solomon says, I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill. But time and chance happen to them all. For man does not know his time, like fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare. So the sons of men are snared in a bad time when it falls suddenly upon them. We just don't know when things are going to happen. And as we look and project our lives through this next year, we don't know what's going to happen even 1 moment ahead, let alone a month ahead or 2 months ahead. That's why James says, instead of saying, I'm going to do this or that, you should say, if God wills, I will do this or I will do that. But we just don't know. We're all going to perish physically at some point, but we don't have to perish spiritually. In John 3:16, most famous passage in the whole Bible, I guess, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. As we enter into the new year, let's all remember that life can change in a New York minute. Be ready for whatever comes our way. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, it says, for you yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord comes as a thief in the night. For when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them as labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they shall not escape. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, so that this day should overtake you as a thief. You are all sons of light and sons of the day. We're not of the night nor of darkness. Therefore, let us not sleep as others do, but let us watch and be sober. We have this great hope as Christians of going to heaven when this final day approaches, when this final day arrives. It'll happen suddenly, and people will be saying, well, peace and safety, but the end will come. But just remember that if you are a child of God, if you are in relationship with Jesus Christ and the Father, you will be taken up to be with them for eternity. So as we contemplate this new year, I just want us to think about, all right, I don't want us to go around being afraid every moment. Oh, I wonder what's going to happen to me next. I don't want that. But at the same time, it's coming. At some point, we're all going to leave this earth, and we just need to be ready for it, and always keep Christ in the forethoughts of your mind and what his will is for our lives. And as he said, it's not a tiresome burden. It's actually the best thing for your life to live according to righteousness. And that's the real key to happiness, to love God, love his laws, love the teaching that he has put forth, and follow after that. And so I'd encourage everybody to just renew. Hopefully you've already made this resolution, but just renew it. I want to live my life as best I can, following along the ways that God wants me to, so that I can go to be with him when I leave this earth. We're going to sing a song by way of invitation, song called Because He Lives. Like I said, we're all gonna die. He died, but he was raised again. And just like he was raised again, we too can be raised again. And because he lives, we can live. And so as we sing this song, if you're subject to the invitation and you need to be obedient to the gospel, come while we stand and sing this song.